What starts as an ordinary night at a high-end restaurant turns into a moral reckoning when a homeless veteran faces public humiliation. But everything changes when an unexpected guest steps in to demand justice. How far will the chef go to redeem himself? And what impact will this one night have on everyone involved? Before diving into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. The dinner rush was in full swing at Cuisine Royale, an upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. Every table was booked, filled with patrons dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, their laughter mingling with the soft clinking of glasses. The room radiated sophistication, from the golden chandeliers overhead to the pristine white tablecloths that stretched across each table. The air carried the faint aroma of truffle oil and seared steak, promising a meal that matched the restaurant's Michelin star reputation. At the center of it all was Chef Greg Daniels, the genius behind Cuisine Royale's meteoric rise. With his crisp white chef's coat embroidered with his name, and his perfectly styled silver-streaked hair, Greg was a man who exuded authority. He moved through the kitchen like a conductor guiding a symphony, his sharp commands keeping the rhythm of the staff in perfect harmony. But beneath his polished exterior was a man who thrived on control and perfection, one who rarely tolerated mistakes or anyone he deemed beneath him. Table 5 wants their filet mignon medium rare. Not well done, Greg barked at a junior sous chef, his voice sharp enough to cut through the sizzling of pans. If you can't tell the difference, you have no business working in my kitchen. The young chef nodded hastily, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he rushed to correct the error. Greg didn't have time for apologies. His eyes were already scanning the rest of the kitchen for potential mistakes. He prided himself on running the best restaurant in the city, and he didn't let anyone forget it. Outside the kitchen, Nathan Brooks stood just beyond the restaurant's entrance, hesitant. His clothes were worn, his military jacket faded with time and weather. His eyes darted between the golden glow of the interior and his own reflection in the glass door. For a moment, he considered walking away. This wasn't the kind of place where someone like him belonged, he knew that. But hunger gnawed at his stomach like a relentless tide, and desperation pushed him forward. Taking a deep breath, Nathan stepped inside. The warm air hit him first, followed by the murmur of conversations and the occasional tinkling of laughter. Heads turned, subtle but unmistakable, as he walked toward the hostess stand. He felt their eyes on him, the weight of judgment pressing down on his shoulders. The hostess, a young woman with a polished smile, stiffened as she noticed him approach. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone laced with caution. Nathan cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. I was wondering if I could speak to the manager. Or maybe there's some food you'd be willing to throw out? I'd be happy to work for it." Her smile faltered. "I'll get someone," she said, before retreating toward the kitchen. Nathan stood there awkwardly, aware of how out of place he looked amidst the restaurant's opulence. He shifted on his feet, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. Moments later, Greg appeared, his face already twisted with irritation. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto Nathan. Nathan took a step forward. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I'm just looking for a meal. I'm willing to work for it, clean dishes, take out the trash, whatever you need." Greg's expression hardened as he looked Nathan up and down. His voice dropped to a cold, cutting tone. "This isn't a soup kitchen. We serve clients who pay top dollar for an experience. You walking in here dressed like that is an insult to everything we stand for." Nathan flinched at the words, but he held his ground. "I didn't mean to offend you. I'm just hungry." Greg sneered. "Then go to a diner or a food bank. But don't come in here expecting handouts." The words stung, and Nathan's throat tightened as he swallowed his pride. "I served in the military," he said quietly, hoping that might spark some empathy. "I've fallen on hard times." Greg didn't waver. "Your past doesn't change the fact that you're disrupting my restaurant. Leave before I call security." Nathan's shoulders sagged. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Instead, he turned and walked out, his footsteps heavy with defeat. As the door swung shut behind him, Greg turned to the hostess. "Next time, don't let someone like that inside," he said sharply. "It's bad for the image." The staff exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Greg returned to the kitchen, barking orders as if nothing had happened, while the patrons resumed their conversations, the incident fading as quickly as it had unfolded. Unnoticed by Greg, however, a woman sitting at a corner table had witnessed the entire scene. Her hat was pulled low, and her sunglasses concealed her eyes, but the slight curve of her lips hinted at her disapproval. She adjusted her oversized coat and reached for her glass of water, her movements slow and deliberate. The name Billie Eilish wouldn't register with anyone in the room just yet, but it wouldn't be long before the restaurant and its arrogant chef learned just how much a single moment of cruelty could cost. The restaurant bustled on, seemingly undisturbed by the earlier altercation. Cuisine Royale's patrons were engrossed in their own conversations, savoring their expensive meals and sipping wine that cost more than Nathan Brooks could hope to earn in a month. Greg Daniels had returned to the kitchen, a thin veneer of calm masking the slight irritation he felt from the disruption. In the corner of the dining room, Billie Eilish adjusted her sunglasses and hat, concealing her identity from the curious glances of passing waitstaff. She had come to the restaurant on a whim, craving a quiet meal and some time to reflect. She didn't expect to witness the scene that had just unfolded, a desperate man humiliated for simply asking for help. The cruelty of it lingered in her mind, tugging at her sense of justice. A waiter approached her table, visibly nervous. "Is everything to your liking, miss?" he asked, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. Billie glanced up at him, her expression unreadable behind the dark lenses. "The food is fine," she said simply, her voice soft yet firm. She tilted her head toward the door. "That man who was just here, what's the deal with your boss?" The waiter hesitated, his gaze darting toward the kitchen. "Chef Daniels. He's particular about the image of the restaurant," he said carefully, clearly weighing his words. "He doesn't like disruptions." Billie leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Does he treat everyone like that, or just the ones who can't afford your entrees?" The waiter's face flushed. "I'm sorry, miss. I should get back to my tables." As he retreated, Billie's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of her water glass. Her mind raced, considering the best way to address what she'd witnessed. She wasn't one for grand gestures or unnecessary attention, but she also wasn't one to sit idly by when something felt so deeply wrong. Minutes later, Greg emerged from the kitchen again, scanning the room. He spotted Billie's table and made his way over, his expression carefully neutral. As he approached, she removed her sunglasses, revealing her striking, unmistakable gaze. Greg faltered slightly, his practiced air of confidence wavering for just a moment. "Good evening," he said, recovering quickly. "I'm Chef Daniels. I like to personally check on my guests to ensure everything is to their satisfaction." Billie studied him for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air just long enough to unsettle him. "It's not every day you see a man kicked out of a restaurant for being hungry," she said evenly. Her words were measured, but the edge in her tone was unmistakable. Greg stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I assure you, miss, that was a matter of maintaining the standard of our establishment. Our patrons expect a certain level of exclusivity." "Is that what you call it?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because it looked more like a man begging for food and getting humiliated in return." Greg's face darkened. "With all due respect, I don't think you understand the pressure of running a business like this. People come here for an experience, and we can't allow interruptions like that too." To what Billie interrupted, her voice rising just enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby tables. "To remind people that not everyone in the world is lucky enough to afford your overpriced pasta." Greg's cheeks flushed, but he forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Billie," she supplied, leaning back in her chair. "Miss Billie," he said, his tone clipped. "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you we handle these situations with professionalism." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call yelling at a veteran and throwing him out? Professionalism?" Greg faltered, his polished demeanor slipping further. "If you have a problem with how I run my restaurant, you're welcome to take your concerns elsewhere." Billie smiled faintly, the kind of smile that promised trouble. "Oh, don't worry, chef. I plan to address my concerns right here." She placed her sunglasses back on and folded her arms across her chest, signaling the end of the conversation. Greg lingered for a moment, unsure of what to say. Eventually, he turned on his heel and walked back to the kitchen, fuming. He muttered under his breath about entitled customers and their inability to understand the complexities of running a fine dining establishment. Back at her table, Billie reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she sent a text. Moments later, her manager, who had been seated discreetly at another table, approached. "You want me to handle this?" her manager asked, his voice low. "No," Billie said, her voice firm. "I've got it. But stick around. This is going to get interesting." Her manager nodded and retreated. Billie leaned back in her chair, her mind already working out the next steps. She wasn't here to ruin anyone's night, but she wasn't about to let what she'd seen slide either. The tension in the restaurant had shifted, though most patrons remained oblivious to the undercurrent. Billie Eilish, still seated in her corner booth, appeared calm and composed, but her eyes behind her sunglasses tracked every movement in the dining room. Greg Daniels, meanwhile, was simmering in the kitchen, barking orders with more sharpness than usual. "Where's the duck confit for table 7? Greg shouted, slamming his hand on the pass. "And get me a decent plating on that risotto, or I'll do it myself." The staff scrambled to meet his demands, though several exchanged uneasy glances. The exchange with the mysterious woman had rattled Greg more than he cared to admit. Something about her demeanor unnerved him. She had challenged him without raising her voice, and he wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in his own restaurant. Back in the dining area, Billie waited patiently as her food arrived. A small, elegantly plated dish of seared scallops was placed before her by the waiter, who looked more nervous than ever. "Your scallops, miss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Billie nodded in thanks and picked up her fork, but before taking a bite, she called the waiter back. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying enough weight to make him stop mid-step. "Can you do me a favor?" "Of course," the waiter replied, his posture stiff. "Bring the chef out here," she said, setting her fork down deliberately. "I'd like to have a word with him." The waiter's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. Within moments, Greg appeared, his face carefully composed, though his irritation was palpable. "Is there a problem with your meal, Miss Billie?" he asked, his tone laced with false politeness. "No problem at all," Billie replied, gesturing to the seat across from her. "I just thought we could have a chat. Sit." Greg hesitated, glancing around the room. A few patrons were beginning to take notice of the exchange, their curious gazes flickering between him and the young woman whose identity they still hadn't pieced together. Reluctantly, Greg sat down, his movements stiff. "Look," Greg began, leaning forward slightly, "I understand you may not agree with how I handled that situation earlier, but—" Billie held up a hand, cutting him off. "Do you know who that man was?" Greg blinked, momentarily thrown off. "What man?" "The veteran you kicked out," Billie said, her voice calm but firm. "Do you know his story, what he's been through?" Greg scoffed, crossing his arms. "It doesn't matter who he is. This is a business, not a charity. If we let people like that in, it ruins the atmosphere." Billie tilted her head, studying him. "You don't think he deserves dignity? Respect?" Greg's jaw tightened. "I don't have the luxury of worrying about every sob story that walks through the door. My priority is keeping this place running." Billie leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Funny," she said softly. "You talk about priorities like they're mutually exclusive. You ever think that treating people with kindness might actually elevate this place?" Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Billie held up a hand again. "Before you answer that, let me tell you a little about myself." She removed her sunglasses and set them on the table. The instant her face was fully visible, a ripple of recognition spread through the restaurant. Gasps and whispers began to fill the room as patrons realized who she was. Billie ignored the growing commotion, keeping her focus squarely on Greg. "I'm Billie Eilish," she said, her voice steady. "And I've been around the world. I've seen the best and worst humanity has to offer. But I can tell you this, how you treat the least of us says everything about who you are." Greg's face flushed as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Miss Eilish, I don't see how my policies are any of your business." "Oh, they're my business now," Billie said, her tone sharp. "You think your restaurant's reputation is everything? What do you think happens when word gets out that you threw a homeless veteran out on the street like garbage?" Greg stiffened. Are you threatening me? Billie shook her head. I don't need to threaten you. The truth is enough. But here's the deal, I'm giving you a chance to make this right. Greg frowned, wary. What are you suggesting? Billie Lee leaned forward, her voice low enough that only Greg could hear. You're going to find that man. You're going to offer him a meal free of charge and an apology. And if you're really smart, you'll find a way to help him get back on his feet. Greg's mouth opened, then closed as he processed her words. And if I don't? Billie smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Then you'll find out what it's like when a global audience learns how little you care about people. The color drained from Greg's face. He knew enough about social media and celebrity influence to understand the weight of her words. Slowly he nodded, though the gesture was stiff and reluctant. Fine, he muttered. I'll take care of it. Billie sat back, her smile softening slightly. Good. I'll be watching. As Greg stood and walked back to the kitchen, the whispers in the restaurant grew louder. Billie adjusted her hat, her calm demeanor masking the satisfaction she felt. This wasn't over, not yet, but it was a start. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Greg Daniels paced back and forth, his jaw clenched as he grappled with the ultimatum Billie Eilish had just handed him. His pride warred with the reality of the situation. His reputation, the very foundation of Cuisine Royale's success, was at stake. Outside, whispers about Billie Eilish filled the dining room, and several patrons had already begun pulling out their phones to document the evening. Greg turned to his sous chef, a young woman named Claire who had been with him for years. Find that man, he said through gritted teeth. The homeless guy from earlier. He couldn't have gone far. Claire hesitated, her expression conflicted. Chef, do you really think this is the best way to handle? Just do it, Greg snapped, his voice echoing through the kitchen. The staff froze, their eyes darting between Greg and Claire. With a curt nod, Claire set down her towel and hurried out the back door to search for Nathan. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Billie remained calm, though her presence had become the center of attention. Diners whispered and craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the global superstar, who had unexpectedly chosen their evening as a platform for justice. Billie ignored the murmurs, her focus fixed on the kitchen door, waiting to see if Greg would follow through. Minutes later, Claire returned, guiding Nathan gently by the arm. He looked hesitant, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting to be turned away again. His military jacket hung loosely on his frame, and his weathered face reflected years of hardship. Several diners stared at him, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. Billie stood as Nathan entered, her warm smile cutting through the tension. Nathan, she said, her voice carrying across the room. Thank you for coming back. Nathan hesitated, glancing at Billie before lowering his gaze. I don't want to cause trouble, he muttered. I was just looking for. You're not causing trouble, Billie interrupted, her tone firm yet kind. You deserve to be here as much as anyone else. Greg emerged from the kitchen, his face a mask of forced composure. He approached Nathan with deliberate steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. The dining room had fallen silent, all eyes on the chef as he stood before the man he had humiliated earlier. Nathan, Greg began, his voice strained. I want to apologize for how I treated you earlier. It was wrong of me to dismiss you like that. Nathan blinked, clearly taken aback. You're apologizing, he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Greg nodded stiffly. Yes, and I'd like to offer you a meal on the house, whatever you'd like. Billie watched the exchange closely, her arms crossed. She could see the reluctance in Greg's posture, but she also saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, a man confronting his own ego, however unwillingly. Nathan glanced at Billie, as if seeking her approval. She gave him a small nod. You should eat, she said gently. Let them serve you for a change. Slowly, Nathan allowed himself to be led to a table near the corner. The staff moved quickly, setting down fresh linens and bringing him a menu. He scanned it with uncertainty, the lavish descriptions and high prices a stark contrast to his reality. Order whatever you like, Billie said, taking her seat again. Tonight, you're the guest of honor. As Nathan placed his order, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Some patrons began clapping softly, a few even standing to applaud. Others, though clearly uncomfortable, remained seated, their faces pinched with disapproval. Greg retreated to the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. Played it perfectly, he barked at his sous chefs, his voice unsteady. I don't want a single flaw. Within minutes, the staff brought out Nathan's meal, a beautifully plated filet mignon with truffle, mashed potatoes, and roasted asparagus. The presentation was as meticulous as any other dish that left the kitchen, but this time the moment felt heavier, more significant. Nathan looked down at the meal, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his fork. He took a tentative bite, his eyes widening as the flavors hit his tongue. For the first time in what felt like forever, he tasted not just food, but care that he had all but forgotten existed in the world. Billie raised her glass, signaling to the room. To Nathan, she said, her voice steady and commanding. A man who's given so much, and who deserves so much more. The room erupted into applause, and Nathan's face flushed as he ducked his head. But this time the attention didn't feel humiliating, it felt affirming. In the kitchen, Greg watched through the pass, his stomach twisting. He wasn't sure if the applause was for Nathan or for Billie's intervention, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent years cultivating an image of perfection, but tonight had shown him just how hollow that perfection was when it came at the expense of humanity. As Nathan finished his meal, Billie approached him, crouching beside his table. I want you to know, she said softly, this doesn't have to be a one-time thing. We'll make sure you get the help you need. Nathan's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, Billie replied, her smile warm. Just promise me one thing: when you get back on your feet, pay it forward. Nathan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I will, I promise. As Billie returned to her table, the dining room buzzed with conversation, the earlier discomfort giving way to an electric energy. For one night, at least, the walls of Cuisine Royale had borne witness to more than just fine dining. They had seen kindness, dignity, and the possibility of change. The mood in Cuisine Royale had shifted entirely. The tension that once hung in the air was replaced with an electric buzz, a feeling that something profound had taken place. The clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation grew louder as patrons shared their thoughts on the night's unexpected turn of events. Yet at the center of it all, Nathan sat quietly, finishing his meal with deliberate care, as if each bite were a revelation. Billie Eilish watched from her seat, her expression softening as she observed Nathan. His shoulders, once slumped with weariness, now seemed to carry a little less weight. The simple act of kindness had sparked something, perhaps hope, perhaps dignity, perhaps both. Greg Daniels stood at the pass in the kitchen, watching the dining room unfold. He didn't venture back out, not yet. The sting of his earlier arrogance still burned, and though he had done as Billie asked, the applause for Nathan felt like a sharp rebuke to his pride. For years, he had cultivated a reputation as the best chef in the city, but tonight, his role as an arbiter of luxury seemed trivial compared to the humanity Billie had so effortlessly displayed. In the corner booth, Billie's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Her manager, seated discreetly at a nearby table, had sent her a message. PR fallout handled. Social media response is overwhelmingly positive. Let me know if you want to go public with this. Billie smirked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing back. Not yet. Let's see if he figures it out on his own. As she slid the phone back into her bag, she noticed Nathan pushing his plate away, his appetite finally sated. Billie rose and made her way over to his table, her boots clicking softly against the polished floor. She crouched down beside him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. How are you feeling, Nathan? She asked. Nathan looked at her, his eyes glistening. Like I don't deserve all this, he said quietly, gesturing to the now empty plate and the attention he had received throughout the evening. It's been so long since anyone looked at me like I mattered. Billie placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. You do matter. And you deserve more than this, more than just one meal. There are people who can help you get back on your feet. Let me make a call. Nathan hesitated, his pride warring with his gratitude. But as he looked into Billie's eyes, he saw no pity, only sincerity. He nodded. Okay, he said softly. Thank you. Billie smiled and stood, turning toward the kitchen. She pushed through the swinging doors, catching Greg mid-stride as he barked another order to his sous chefs. "Chef Daniels," she called out, her voice cutting through the kitchen clamor. Greg turned, startled. He quickly composed himself, straightening his jacket. "Miss Eilish," he said stiffly, "is there something else you need?" "Yes," Billie said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I need you to think about what kind of legacy you want to leave behind." Greg frowned, unsure how to respond. "You're a brilliant chef," Billie continued, "but brilliance means nothing if it's built on arrogance. Tonight you had the chance to show real leadership, not just in the kitchen but as a person. You took it, but barely. Think about that." Greg's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Miss Eilish, I did what you asked. I apologized. I gave the man a meal. What more do you want from me?" Billie studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "I want you to do better, not because someone like me is watching, but because it's the right thing to do. People like Nathan shouldn't have to beg for dignity. You have the power to make a difference. Use it." Greg opened his mouth to retort but stopped. Her words struck a chord, though he hated to admit it. He nodded once, curtly, and turned back to the pass, his thoughts racing. By the time Billie returned to the dining room, Nathan was standing, his jacket draped over his arm. Several patrons had approached him, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back, and offering words of encouragement. The look on his face was one of overwhelmed gratitude. Billie gestured for her manager, who handed her a discreet envelope. She pressed it into Nathan's hand. "This has the number of someone who can help you," she said. "They're expecting your call." Nathan glanced at the envelope, then back at Billie. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Billie said, smiling. "Just promise me one thing when you're in a position to help someone else. Don't hesitate." Nathan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." As he turned to leave, the restaurant erupted into another round of applause. Nathan paused at the door, looking back at Billie one last time before stepping into the night. Billie returned to her table, her work for the evening done. She motioned to the waiter for her check, but the young man shook his head. "It's on the house, Miss Eilish," he said, smiling nervously. "Good," Billie replied with a wink. "Use the tip I was going to leave to feed someone who needs it." As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she noticed Greg standing at the edge of the dining room, his arms crossed, watching her. There was a new look in his eyes, not the defensive arrogance from earlier, but something softer, something that hinted at the possibility of change. Billie gave him a small nod before walking out, her presence leaving a lasting impression not just on the restaurant but on everyone who had witnessed the night's events. For Greg Daniels, the night had been a reckoning. For Nathan Brooks, it was a step toward redemption. And for everyone else, it was a reminder that kindness, even in its simplest form, could be revolutionary. The restaurant quieted as the door swung shut behind Nathan. For a brief moment, the dining room stood still, the gravity of the evening settling into the minds of everyone present. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, though the air was still charged with the energy of what had unfolded. Greg Daniels lingered at the edge of the dining room, his arms crossed and his thoughts heavy. He had built his career on precision and control, curating an environment where only the elite dined and the less fortunate were invisible by design. Tonight, that carefully constructed world had been shaken to its core by one act of defiance, one homeless man, and one celebrity who had forced him to confront his own values. In the kitchen, the staff moved cautiously, watching their usually confident leader stare out at the dining room with a distant expression. Claire, his sous chef, approached him hesitantly. "Chef," she asked, her voice gentle. "Are you okay?" Greg turned to her, his face betraying a mixture of frustration and reflection. "Fine," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Tonight had left a mark on him, one he wasn't sure he could shake. Claire tilted her head, her expression softening. "You know, you did the right thing out there. It might have been uncomfortable, but it mattered." Greg frowned, looking back toward the empty table where Nathan had sat. "Did it? Or did I just do what I had to because I didn't have a choice?" "Does it matter?" Claire asked. "What matters is what you do next." Greg didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back into the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps fading into the buzz of the dining room. Outside, Nathan stood under a street lamp, the envelope Billie had given him clutched tightly in his hand. The night air was cool, but for the first time in a long time he didn't feel its chill. The warmth of the meal, the kindness he had been shown, it lingered, filling a void that had long been empty. He unfolded the envelope and stared at the card inside. The name and number of a local organization that specialized in helping veterans were printed neatly in bold letters. It felt surreal, holding the possibility of change in his hands. For years he had convinced himself that he was beyond saving, that the world had moved on and left him behind. Tonight had challenged that belief. Nathan took a deep breath and tucked the card into his pocket. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years he was willing to find out. Back inside the restaurant, Billie Eilish was preparing to leave. She slung her bag over her shoulder and adjusted her oversized coat, ignoring the lingering stares from diners who still couldn't believe she had graced their presence. Her manager approached, his phone in hand. "Social media's blowing up," he said, showing her a flood of posts about the night's events. Videos, photos, testimonials, it's all over the place. People are calling it inspiring. Billie smirked, slipping her sunglasses back on. "Good. Let it inspire." Her manager hesitated. "You sure you don't want to make a statement? The press is already reaching out." Billie shook her head. "I don't need to say anything. The story speaks for itself." Besides, she glanced toward the kitchen, where Greg had disappeared. "The real statement is what happens next." As she made her way toward the door, the waiter who had served her rushed up. "Miss Eilish," he said, a little breathless. "Thank you for tonight. I think it changed a lot of people." Billie smiled, a soft but knowing smile. "That's the point, isn't it?" she said before stepping out into the cool night air. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at Cuisine Royale spread far and wide. Social media lit up with hashtags like Kindness Matters and Billie Inspires. The restaurant received a flood of calls, some from people praising the night's events, others criticizing Greg's initial treatment of Nathan. Reservations surged, though not all the attention was positive. For Greg, the aftermath was a wake-up call. He spent hours reading the comments online, some praising his eventual actions, others lambasting his behavior. But what struck him most were the stories people sharing their own struggles, their experiences with homelessness, and the ways small acts of kindness had changed their lives. It forced him to confront the truth he had spent years avoiding. His success meant nothing if it came at the expense of his humanity. 2 weeks later, Nathan stood outside a small office building, the card Billie had given him tucked neatly into his pocket. He had made the call the morning after their encounter, and now he was here for his first appointment. The nerves twisted in his stomach, but he pushed through them, stepping inside. The receptionist greeted him warmly, and within minutes he was sitting with a counselor who specialized in helping veterans transition back into stable lives. For the first time in years, Nathan felt like he wasn't alone. At Cuisine Royale, the changes were subtle but significant. Greg had implemented a new policy: a portion of every meal's proceeds would go toward local charities, including the organization that had helped Nathan. He had also started offering free meals to veterans once a week, an idea inspired by the night Billie Eilish walked into his restaurant and turned his world upside down. Greg wasn't perfect, and he knew he had a long way to go. But he was trying, and for the first time he felt like his success meant something more than just stars on a review. As for Billie, she moved on to her next destination, carrying the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. She didn't need the credit or the accolades. She had seen the spark of change, and that was enough. And for Nathan, Greg, and everyone who witnessed that night, the lesson was clear: kindness wasn't just an act. It was a catalyst, a force that could ripple out and change lives in ways no one could predict.